Hi, my name is John Basl from Bowling Green State University, soon to be at Northeastern University. I'm here to offer comments on Jason Moeller's talk and paper titled Valuing Nature, A History of Instrumentality. Before getting started, I'd just like to give a quick thanks to Coastal Carolina University for hosting this kind of conference. I think it's a fantastic idea. It's an excellent venue for undergraduates to showcase their work, and I'm really excited to be a part of it, so thanks. I'd also like to thank Jason for his contribution. It was a lot of fun reading his paper, and I'm glad to be able to provide comments for it. So let's get started. Jason's paper is primarily a defense, I think, of three theses. The first thesis is that standard and some non-standard accounts of intrinsic value fail to appropriately ground or explain the nature of our moral relationships with the natural world. In particular, I take it he means ecosystems, and most of his examples involve ecosystems. The second and primary, I think, thesis is that the appropriate moral relationship with nature can be grounded in a kind of instrumental value that I'll call historical instrumental value. Roughly, the thesis is that nature is so historically instrumentally valuable that it gives nature the moral status required to ground certain obligations we have to it without appeal to any metaphysically strange kind of intrinsic value. Finally, the third thesis is a thesis about the practical implications of recognizing that historical instrumental value of nature. Jason counsels that we should, in the words of Holmes Ralston III, follow nature. I'm going to confine my comments to the first two theses. Lots of people have commented on Ralston's thesis. I think that with enough qualification, there's a sense in which nature should be followed, in the sense that we can learn things from nature, and this is often demonstrated by the way we use technologies to take advantage of properties of natural systems. But not much of what Jason says is dedicated to the following nature thesis, so I'm just going to set that aside. Jason, appropriately, starts by providing some motivations for thinking that nature must be intrinsically valuable. He, like many environmental ethicists, thinks that an anthropocentric ethic, one on which only human beings have direct moral status, provides inadequate grounds for environmental protections. Unlike others, Jason thinks that it's equally problematic to solve this problem by appeal to the intrinsic value of nature, under some construal of what that means. Thus, he's motivated to seek a middle ground, one that avoids the troubles he raises for the standard accounts of intrinsic value. Before addressing Jason's arguments against some of the more standard accounts of intrinsic value, I want to say just about the inadequacy of anthropocentrism. Jason, in the paper, though not in his talk, motivates the inadequacy by claiming that even if a rainforest could be harvested in a way that results in no harm to any sentient animals, it seems like the destruction of that rainforest would somehow be wrong. I'm inclined to agree that we ought not to destroy a rainforest without good cause, even if we can do so without harming any sentient organisms. And if that's right, then it tells us that our environmental obligations can't be grounded simply by appeal to the extant interests of sentient beings. It doesn't follow, however, that we must thereby attribute any particular value to nature itself. We might think that by destroying an ecosystem, we deprive future generations of something they could value deeply. But assuming that the destruction of the rainforest results in different individuals being born, it can't be that they're harmed by that destruction. Of course, we can rule out those kinds of values as well. We can imagine a version of what's typically called the last man thought experiment, where we imagine that the last man on Earth plans to destroy a rainforest that has no sentient beings in it, insofar as that can be a rainforest, I guess. We can imagine that he's already committed a wrong by killing all the sentient beings, so that's how he's removed them. And now he's considering destroying the otherwise stable ecosystem that remains. Many will still have the intuition that he does something wrong, the last man, and yet this doesn't provide motivation for thinking that ecosystems must have some value. One prominent position in environmental ethics is that of biocentric individualism, or biocentrism. This is the view that all organisms, sentient or non-sentient, have morally considerable interests, that they have a kind of intrinsic value that I'll talk about later. Plants, for example, have a good of their own, and agents have an obligation to take that good into their account in their moral deliberations. That's the view. The last man case described above doesn't give us a reason, even a prima facie reason, I think, to think that we must attribute intrinsic value to nature. The problem is that it's hard to tell whether the destruction of the ecosystem is wrong or bad because of the destruction of the individual organisms or because of the destruction of the ecosystem itself. And if we don't have a reason to think that the wrongness or badness accrues because of the destruction of the environment itself, we don't have to worry in the first place about the oddness of the intrinsic value of nature. We only have to worry about the intrinsic value of a certain kind of the individual organisms that make it up. I guess we could imagine instead that the last man, it won't destroy the ecosystem, or he'll destroy the ecosystem by merely dividing up the individual organisms and ensuring that each of their lives, that each lives a life where their biological interests are satisfied. That's the only interest non-sentient beings have, according to biocentrists. So the ecosystem is effectively destroyed and all the organisms are unharmed. However, I have to admit that in a case like this, I'm just not sure what to think. Of course, I think we ought not attempt to do this to any ecosystem, but that's at least in part because I'm skeptical about our success in not harming any of the inhabitants while doing it. So there is, I think, a lot more to say about this, about how we're supposed to weigh our intuitions about these kinds of last man cases and what they tell us about the intrinsic value of nature versus the intrinsic value of the individuals that compose nature. But I'm going to set all that aside for now and turn to the other arguments of the paper. So let's consider the first thesis described above, earlier. That our moral obligations to nature can't be grounded in nature's intrinsic value. Jason picks out several views about the nature of intrinsic value for discussion, including a kind of intrinsic value grounded in instrumental value, defended by Robert Elliott. I'm going to focus on 3 versions of intrinsic value that Jason criticizes, but I'm not going to talk about his criticism of Elliott. One way environmental philosophers have described intrinsic value is by contrasting it with instrumental value. So something's intrinsically valuable only if it has some non-instrumental value. That is, it's valuable beyond its value as a means to certain ends. Jason is skeptical of this kind of value. He claims that it ignores the fact that nature is obviously extremely instrumentally valuable. I have to admit I find this objection puzzling. Of course nature is extremely instrumentally valuable, but that doesn't preclude nature from also having intrinsic value, non-instrumental value. For example, many married individuals value intrinsically the symbols of their marriage, usually rings. It's not because they serve as any means to an end, they're just valuable in themselves. They value them in and of themselves as symbols. If the time comes their married couple must pawn their rings, they face some economic difficulty, those rings might come to have immense instrumental value. It's the way they're going to survive, is by selling them. But presumably they would still retain their symbolic non-instrumental value. So those values aren't in competition in any certain sense. Maybe in practical context they are, but you can have both kinds. So that just frames a puzzle with understanding exactly what the objection is supposed to be. So other things that Jason says makes it seem as if he might intend to argue that if it's possible to ground an environmental ethic purely on the instrumental value of nature, we should do so, because the instrumental value of nature is just so much more obvious. And this might make sense as a pragmatic principle when we're trying to convince people to act in certain ways regarding the environment. But from a moral point of view, I think this principle is unpersuasive. What could possibly justify the view? Is there some sort of moral parsimony principle such that we shouldn't multiply value beyond necessity? That doesn't seem right. Our goal in moral theorizing is to recognize all the values that there are, not merely the values that will explain the obligations we perceive ourselves to have in a given context. Humans have great instrumental value to one another, and yet even if this instrumental value grounded all the obligations we perceived ourselves to have in our current context, it would not be a full account of the value that humans have. Furthermore, it's not plausible that the obligations grounded in instrumental value would be identical to those grounded in intrinsic value, understood non-instrumentally. It may be true that the full instrumental value of nature grounds the same set of obligations in our current context. That is, we have the same actual obligations to nature and its inhabitants, whether we understand them as having intrinsic or instrumental value. But these different types of value have different implications in different contexts. After all, we started by considering the wrongness of destruction of an ecosystem where we supposed the ecosystem had no instrumental value at all, and we thought that was wrong. The point is that there are modal differences in the obligations grounded in intrinsic versus instrumental value. And these are important to capture from a moral point of view. To ignore intrinsic value, if it's there, is to make a mistake. The same kind of worry, I think, arises even on the form of instrumental value than Jason advocates. It's going to have different modal implications than the kind of intrinsic value he wants to reject here. Okay, now turning to the second kind of intrinsic value that Jason discusses. A second kind of intrinsic value that he considers is one that I'm going to call inherent worth. Other people have called it moral considerability, but we might also call it something like Kantian intrinsic value. This kind of value is supposed to be analogous to the kind of value had by persons, in virtue of which we must take them into account in our moral deliberations. It's not uncommon to recognize that persons have a certain kind of non-instrumental value, they ground certain obligations to them, and so you might think nature has a similar kind of value. Jason's main objection to thinking that nature has inherent worth, as I'm calling it, is that that nature lacks the capacities in humans, or perhaps some non-humans, that can serve as the basis for inherent worth. Ecosystems have fluid boundaries and no clear conditions for identity. Furthermore, they lack the cognitive capacities that ground the worth of humans, according to Jason. I'm sympathetic to the idea that ecosystems, at least typical ones, are not the kinds of things that have cognitive capacities, and they aren't even entities in the same way as humans or individual organisms in most cases. However, I'm skeptical about what I'm going to call the consciousness condition on inherent worth. According to the consciousness condition, it is a necessary condition for having inherent worth that a thing have cognitive capacities. The typical defense of this condition rests on the idea that it is a precondition for having inherent worth that a thing have a good of its own, and consciousness is a precondition for having such a good. So a thing cannot even have a welfare or a good of its own unless it's conscious. I, as well as others such as Gary Varner, Paul Taylor, Kenneth Goodpaster, Ronald Sandler, have argued that something may have a good without being conscious. That, of course, doesn't constitute a defense, but given how naturally we talk of the good of organisms, for example, we say that water is good for oak trees without a hint of metaphor, it seems at least that a defense of the consciousness condition, not the mere assertion of it, is required for Jason to make his point. If it turns out that organisms, even if not ecosystems, have a good, then it is perhaps plausible that they have inherent worth. This isn't to say that our obligations to organisms will be the same as our obligations to humans. We must recognize that recognizing worth doesn't entail equal worth, and certainly doesn't entail consideration of worth in the same way for all beings. After all, we might recognize the worth of sentient beings, sentient animals, the non-human sentient animals, without thinking our obligations to them are coextensive with our obligations to other humans. As Singer might put it, equal consideration of interest does not entail equal treatment. So it could be that so the main objection that Jason's main objection is that it's sort of odd to think that ecosystems might have inherent worth, but the oddness is supposed to come from thinking that they might be treated in the same way. That's not a plausible grounds for rejecting that they have this kind of worth. Finally, Jason considers an interpretation of intrinsic value in terms of intrinsic properties. On this view, intrinsic value is something an entity or object has only in virtue of its intrinsic properties as opposed to its relational ones. Jason here points out that whatever obligations we have to nature stem in part from our relationship to nature. If we didn't exist, we'd have no obligations. While I think that's obviously the case, it doesn't follow that all values are grounded in relational properties. Imagine I'm the only being that exists and assume there are no moral obligations to oneself. It wouldn't follow that I lacked value or that I only have value once someone comes to exist that appreciates my value. Presumably, I have value in virtue of my intrinsic properties, some value at least, but there's nobody around to respond appropriately. Value, plausibly, supervenes in some cases on intrinsic properties, even though appropriate responsiveness to that value presumes the existence of other agents. So I don't think there are any good grounds for thinking that intrinsic value couldn't supervene on intrinsic properties. I do happen to think that whether or not intrinsic value, or whether or not the value of individuals supervenes on intrinsic or relational properties is orthogonal to the issues of the intrinsic value of nature. It's not going to tell us whether it has intrinsic value or not. You have to know which intrinsic and which relational properties ground value, and so that's a fair point. But I do not think we have grounds to think that whatever the appropriate value of nature is, it's got to be grounded in its relational properties. So far, I focused on the objections to intrinsic value, and I hope to have shown that there's space for proponents of intrinsic value to defend the value of, if not ecosystems, at least organisms, in a way that might ground obligations to nature that crude forms of anthropocentrism cannot. Even if I succeeded, Jason's claim that we can ground such obligations in terms of a new and important kind of instrumental value is still, both new and important. So if there's a plurality of values that imply strong obligations to nature, they should be taken into account, especially if they provide compelling reasons for more people to act in environmentally sound ways. One might worry from the very start that no account of instrumental value could ground the moral status of nature in a way that, for example, avoids the conclusion that it is okay to destroy an ecosystem so long as no individuals are harmed. This is because instrumental value, by its very nature, is subjective or agent relative, and therefore our obligations to any ecosystem per se depends on our subjective valuing. If we don't value it instrumentally, then it lacks the value that might prevent us from destroying it. Jason wants to navigate this difficulty by distinguishing instrumental value from subjective value. He says, and I quote, "If something is instrumentally valuable to perform a certain task, then it is instrumentally valuable for everyone that wishes to perform that desired task." End quote. While it is true that things, perhaps health, can be generally instrumentally valuable, that is, of instrumental value to all or almost all people in similar contexts, or even all contexts, it seems odd to think that instrumental value isn't subjective in the sense that it is goal relative. Imagine that I have the goal of dunking a basketball without jumping, but with my arm fully outstretched. So I want to be able to dunk a ball by just doing this and drop and, putting my arm over the rim. I'm going to need a platform that's raised about 2.5 to 3 feet. So that's going to be extremely instrumentally valuable for me, if that's my goal. Kevin Garnett, on the other hand, would not be able to accomplish this task described the way I have, by standing on a platform of similar. He'd just be too high. He couldn't dunk the ball. He'd be throwing it over the backboard. He'd have to bend his arm, so he couldn't keep his arm outstretched the way I want to accomplish the task. So the same object, in the same circumstance, even if we have the same goals, can vary in its instrumental value. And that's just to say that not everything is generally instrumentally valuable. So we'll need some argument that history is generally instrumentally valuable if Jason's form of instrumental value is to ground obligations for all of us. According to Jason, our environmental obligations are partially grounded in the historical instrumental value of ecosystems. Jason draws on Plato's description of Socrates' relationship to the laws of Athens in the Crito. Despite its being instrumentally disvaluable in the standard sense of instrumental value to obey the laws, Socrates professes to recognize that he owes his life to Athens, and so it would be wrong to disobey those laws in degrading the city. He recognized he owes his life to Athens, so it would be wrong to disobey those laws. According to Jason, we stand in a similar relationship to nature, and given this, we have an obligation to nature independently of whether nature would be more useful to us in the standard sense of instrumental value, chopped up and used as firewood. So, what do we say to this? Even if we assume that Socrates is correct about his obligations to follow the law, it need not be in virtue of his historical relationship per se. Instead, we might think that we have an obligation to follow laws that are legitimately instituted, even when they're bad for us in our current context. We can ask reasonably whether Socrates really has an obligation to obey the laws otherwise. With respect to nature, we can ask a similar question. We can ask, is it really valuable in virtue of the role it played in our existence? While it's almost certainly true that I would not exist if nature were radically different, I think it implausible that this grounds any obligations or gives nature any additional value at all. It's certainly the case that many individuals owe their lives to the historical existence of some truly awful places. The Holocaust, for example, influenced which individuals in the future did or did not come to exist. Relationships were formed or did not form in light of the existence of detention or death camps. However, this hardly seems to provide a reason not to destroy Auschwitz. There may be a reason not to destroy Auschwitz. Maybe it should stand as a reminder and a moral lesson for us. But certainly it's not because any individuals owe it any sort of respect because it played a role in their existence. So to wrap up, I'm not yet convinced that we should give up on intrinsic value or that it's metaphysically odd, at least on some understandings of what it is. And I'm also skeptical that the historical role nature plays in our existence grounds any particular obligations to preserve or follow it. And I think part of that follows because, in addition, I'm skeptical of history playing some sort of instrumental role that could ground very strong obligations to nature. Okay, thank you.